Against the Flood. Against the Flood on 4 April 2009, in the auditorium at Biola University in La Mirada, California, Christopher Hitchens debated William Lane Craig on the existence of God. The debate is one of the most studied in the contemporary apologetic atheism literature, and the most studied feature of it is the way Craig structured his opening. Craig opened with 5 arguments. He gave each of them less than 4 minutes. The arguments were the 5 he had been refining for 2 decades. The cosmological argument from the universe's beginning, the teleological argument from fine-tuning, the moral argument from the existence of objective values, the ontological argument from God's possible existence, and the argument from the historical resurrection of Jesus. Each was presented with formal precision, with named premises, with logical structure. Each, considered on its own, would require half an hour of careful philosophical engagement to answer responsibly. Craig had given Hitchens 20 minutes for a substantive response to all 5. This is a flood. The flood, sometimes called the Gish Gallop in informal usage, after Duane Gish, the creationist debater who pioneered the technique in the 1970s, exploits a structural asymmetry in argument. Making a claim takes a sentence. Refuting a claim takes a paragraph. Carefully refuting a sophisticated claim takes a page. Time, in any debate, is finite. If the opponent throws enough claims into the available time, the defender cannot refute them all. Whatever is left unrefuted appears to the audience as unrefuted, which the audience may interpret as unrefutable. The flood does not require any of its individual claims to be strong. It requires only that the volume exceed the defender's capacity to respond. Hitchens, in his 20 minutes, did not attempt to refute all 5 of Craig's arguments. He had been preparing for years. He knew the structure of the technique he was facing. He had rehearsed his counter to it. He selected 2 of the 5, the cosmological and the moral, and refuted each with care. He noted that the ontological argument was a verbal trick that had been recognized as such since Kant. He noted that the teleological argument depended on premises about the alternatives to a designed universe that Craig had not defended. He noted that the resurrection argument was a historical claim that required a different kind of evidence than Craig had presented, and that he was not, in 20 minutes, going to engage with the historiography of first-century Palestine. He then said, plainly, that he was refusing to engage with the flood as a flood. He named the technique. He pointed out that the structure of Craig's opening required Hitchens, if he were to respond on Craig's terms, to spend the entire debate playing defense against 5 separate cases, none of which had been adequately developed in the time Craig had given each of them. He declined the structure. He gave his own opening, a sustained case against the existence of a personal God, organized around 2 or 3 central claims developed at length, and he held that ground for the rest of the debate. Whether Hitchens or Craig is judged to have won the Biola debate depends partly on the audience's prior commitments and partly on the standard of judgment applied. By the standard of refuting Craig's arguments in detail, Hitchens did not refute Craig's arguments in detail. By the standard of demonstrating the technique Craig was using and refusing to be governed by it, Hitchens succeeded. The debate is studied, in subsequent decades, as a teaching example of the flood and its principal counter. This chapter is the move. We will name the flood structure, the 3 principal counters, Shankara's approach to multi-school objections in the Brahma Sutra Bhashya, and a contemporary instance from a different domain. The flood works by exploiting 4 asymmetries. The first is the asymmetry of length. Claims are short, refutations are long. The defender, refuting carefully, cannot match the opponent's volume. The second is the asymmetry of attention. Claims are easy to follow. Refutations require the audience to hold the original claim in mind while the refutation unfolds. Audience attention degrades over the course of a long refutation. Some of the audience will drop out before the refutation completes. Claims, by contrast, do not require sustained attention. Each can be evaluated as it lands. The third is the asymmetry of salience. The opponent's claims, once made, are vivid in the room. The defender's refutations, when they come, are fighting against the salience of the claims they refute. A refutation that successfully demonstrates the falsity of a claim does not erase the audience's memory of having heard the claim. The claim continues to be available as a candidate for belief. The fourth, and most exploited, is the asymmetry of standards. Most audiences hold opponents to a low standard for making claims, make a claim, however briefly, and the defender to a high standard for refuting claims, refute fully, with citation, with careful reasoning. The double standard is rarely articulated. It operates in the audience's perception. The opponent who exploits it produces flood after flood, while the defender produces refutation after refutation, and the volume of unrefuted residue grows. The flood exploiting these four asymmetries can defeat a more knowledgeable defender if the defender does not have a counter prepared. The defender who attempts to match the flood, to refute every claim in the time available, will fall behind, will cease to be coherent, and will be perceived as overmatched. The defender's task is therefore not to match the flood. It is to refuse to be governed by the flood structure. 3 counters to the flood are reliable. Counter 1. Pick the strongest. The defender selects the strongest of the opponent's claims and refutes it at full quality. The selection is critical. If the defender selects a weak claim and refutes it, the audience perceives that the defender has handled an easy case, while the difficult cases remain. The selected claim must be the one the audience perceives as the opponent's strongest, or one of them. The refutation, having been performed at full quality, is then leveraged. The defender notes that the refuted claim was the opponent's strongest. The others were variations, derivatives, or applications of structures the strongest claim shared. The audience is invited to extend the refutation to the unrefuted claims. This counter requires the defender to have rapid recognition of which claim, among many, is the strongest. The training for this is breadth, having engaged the standard moves in the relevant literature, so that the defender recognizes the strongest move as the strongest in real time when it is offered. Counter 2. Name the flood. The defender names to the audience what the opponent has done. The naming is plain. The opponent has presented many claims in rapid succession. This is a tactic called the flood. It depends on the audience accepting that unrefuted claims are unrefutable. I am declining to be governed by this tactic. The naming has 2 functions. First, it informs the segment of the audience that did not recognize the tactic. The recognition, once given, persists, and the audience will watch subsequent floods with reduced credit. Second, it puts the opponent in the position of having to defend. The use of the tactic, which the opponent typically cannot do without conceding that they were attempting to win on volume rather than on substance. The danger of naming the flood is that it can read as evasion if the defender does not also produce substantive refutations. The naming should be paired with at least one strong refutation. Without the refutation, the naming sounds like complaint. With the refutation, the naming is the diagnosis of the structure within which the refutation is offered. Counter 3. Demand the strongest. The defender, instead of selecting the strongest claim themselves, demands that the opponent select. Of these arguments, which is the one you would stake your case on? Which is the one you regard as decisive? Let us focus there. This counter shifts the burden of selection from the defender to the opponent. The opponent now has 2 options. Identify a strongest claim, in which case the debate becomes about that claim and the flood has been neutralized, or refuse to identify a strongest claim, in which case the audience sees that the opponent regards the volume as the case, which damages the opponent's credibility. Demand the strongest is the most ambitious of the 3 counters. It works best when the audience is sophisticated enough to perceive the move and when the format permits the defender to insist on a response. In formats where the opponent can simply continue the flood without responding to the demand, the counter is less effective. In formats with strict alternation, it is highly effective. The three counters can be combined. Hitchens at Biola combined all three. He picked the strongest, the cosmological argument, refuted it carefully, named the flood as a flood, and implicitly demanded that Craig defend the structure of his opening. The combination, in 20 minutes, demonstrated that the technique was visible to the defender and would not be allowed to govern the debate. Shankara, in the Brahma Sutra Bhashya, faced floods of objections from multiple schools simultaneously. The Mimamsa, the Sankhya, the Vaisheshika, the Nyayika, the Charvaka, and several Buddhist schools all had developed objections to the Advaita position. The objections, considered as a whole, formed a flood larger than any defender could address claim by claim within the limits of any single text. Shankara's approach to the flood was prioritization. He did not weight all objections equally. He weighted by structural importance. The objections that, if accepted, would collapse the doctrine entirely received the longest treatment. The objections that would only modify minor details received short treatment. The objections that depended on premises Shankara had refuted elsewhere were dispatched by reference to the prior refutation. The total length of treatment for any objection was calibrated to the structural threat it posed. This is a methodological approach to the flood that scales beyond any single debate. Shankara did not treat the network of opposing positions as a list of items to be addressed in order. He treated it as a structured topology, with central nodes whose refutation would cascade and peripheral nodes whose refutation could be brief. The Brahma Sutra Bhashya's allocation of pages reflects this topology. Some chapters of the commentary are dominated by single objections developed for many pages. Others run through multiple objections in succession, each receiving a paragraph, because the objections have already been answered in their structural form. The approach is not sneering. Shankara does not refuse to address minor objections. He addresses them, but at the length they deserve. The audience reading the commentary can verify, on inspection, that the major threats have received major treatment. The audience can also verify that the minor threats have received treatment proportionate to their stakes. The proportionality is itself a feature the audience recognizes as competent. This is what handling a flood looks like at scale. The defender does not match the flood claim by claim. The defender meets the flood at its structural level, allocates resources by structural threat, and lets the audience verify the proportionality. The contemporary parallel from a different domain is the work of Steven Pinker, whose books The Better Angels of Our Nature, 2011, and Enlightenment, now 2018, advanced large-scale empirical theses about declining violence and improving human conditions. The books were widely read. They were also widely criticized, and the criticism, when it came, often took the form of floods. Critics produced lists of empirical objections, particular wars, particular regions, particular metrics, particular interpretive choices. The lists were long. Some of the items on the lists were sound, many were not. Pinker's response, over the course of the decade following the book's publication, has been to apply the same approach Shankara applied. He has not attempted to refute every objection on every list. He has identified the structural objections, the ones that, if accepted, would damage the central thesis, and has answered those at length. He has identified the surface objections, the ones that, even if accepted, would not damage the central thesis, and has answered those briefly or, in some cases, conceded them. This is not the only available strategy in the face of large-scale criticism. It is, however, a strategy whose structure is teachable and whose execution is verifiable by careful readers. Pinker's response to the floods has not made him popular among his critics, who would have preferred matching engagement at the level of every detail. It has made him intellectually defensible, in the sense that the central thesis has not been damaged by the cumulative weight of objections that individually do not bear on the central thesis. The parallel to the Brahma Sutra Bhashya is structural. In both cases, the defender faces a flood that cannot be matched by claim engagement. In both cases, the defender allocates resources by structural threat and lets the audience verify the allocation. In both cases, the central thesis survives because it has been defended where it needed to be defended, and not where the defending would have served only the appearance of thoroughness. A note on what flood defense is not. The flood defense is not the move where you ignore the opponent's claims because there are too many of them. Ignoring is not refusing to engage. It is refusing to engage at length. The defender who simply ignores the flood without naming it or demonstrating that they have engaged with at least one of its claims at full quality will be perceived by the audience as having no answer. The naming and strongest refutation pair is the difference between strategic refusal and surrender. The flood defense is also not the move where you accuse the opponent of bad faith. Some opponents who flood are doing so deliberately as a tactic, many are not. The flood is sometimes the natural shape of how a confident speaker presents many considerations they regard as relevant. Accusing the opponent of bad faith, when the opponent may simply be enthusiastic, damages your own credibility with audiences who do not share your prior assessment of the opponent. Naming the flood as a structural feature of the situation, this is what is happening, this is why I am responding the way I am, does not require attributing motive. The naming should be neutral about motive and precise about structure. The flood defense, executed precisely, treats the flood as a feature of the engagement rather than as a moral failing of the opponent. The treatment is what allows the audience to learn the recognition without being recruited into a personal dispute.